Can Marine Le Pen win the French presidency? The leader of the far-right National Front says French culture and values are under threat. She blames globalisation and what she calls Islamic fundamentalism. Can the rise of populism in Europe propel her to the presidency? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. The leader of the National Front in France, Marine Le Pen, has announced her bid to become president. The far-right leader is hoping to ride the same wave of nationalism that led to Brexit and elected Donald Trump president of the US. The French election has been thrown wide open now that the frontrunner, Francois Fillon, is engulfed in a corruption scandal. So will France turn the tide of populism or be another country to follow the trend? Natasha Butler reports from Lyon, where Le Pen launched her presidential campaign.
They want Marine Le Pen to be France's next president. And as she took to the stage, the far-right candidate had a clear message that France's culture and values are under threat, and she will fight for French sovereignty.
Two ideologies want to submerge our country, global finance and radical Islam. Confronting these two totalitarian ideologies challenges our liberty and our country. The global economy kills by suffocating slowly and aggressively. Fundamental Islam is aggressive and planned harassment against the French Republic.
Thousands of people came to Le Pen's campaign launch in the city of Lyon, won over by her promise to protect French jobs, cut rights for foreigners and keep Europe at bay. Campaign posters tell a story of a nation where poverty leaves French citizens in the cold but houses refugees.
Marine Le Pen and the National Front say things as they are. Today, we're in a situation where being French gives you less rights than being a foreigner.
Marine Le Pen is positioning herself as the anti-elite, anti-establishment presidential candidate in this election. She says that French voters are simply fed up of traditional politics and politicians. And after the Brexit vote and Donald Trump's victory in the United States, the feeling is here that this is her moment.
Patriots across the world are rising up and saying there is something wrong, which is why they are voting for people who represent the people.
Marine Le Pen is our last chance. She has to win now.
Le Pen's been trying to soften her image, but some say she remains too extreme for most voters. Opinion polls suggest she'd make it to the first round of the election, but lose in the final runoff.
Most research indicates that 70% of French voters reject the idea of the National Front, so it's hard to see how she could win the presidential election in May.
With the Conservative candidate and former front-runner Francois Fillon fighting accusations of paying relatives for fake jobs, the race has opened up for centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron, who's socially liberal and pro-business. Macron was also campaigning in Lyon in a race which is increasingly unpredictable. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Lyon.
Well, let's take a look at who else is running for president. Republican candidate Francois Fillon was riding high in the polls up until last week before what's being called the Penelopegate scandal. Support has dropped after allegations of misusing public funds to pay his wife for work she didn't do. Now the frontrunner is Emmanuel Macron from the centrist party En Marche. He was economy minister until he resigned last year. Then there's socialist candidate Benoît Hamon. He was briefly education minister under President Francois Hollande. Well, let's bring in our guests from Paris. We have Renaud Girard, who's a chief foreign correspondent for Figaro French newspaper. Rémi Piet is a research associate with the University of Miami, who specialises in French-EU relations, and he joins us from there. And Yasser Louati also joins us from Paris. He's a civil liberties and human rights activist. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. Mr. Girard, in Paris, let me just begin with you. Do you think Marine Le Pen really has a chance of becoming the next French president?
It will be very difficult for her because the French system is not like the American system. There are 2 rounds of election and you really need more than 50% of the popular vote to become the president. Yes, she's like Donald Trump, an outsider. She doesn't belong to what she calls the system, but she, for the time being, she lacks an ally on the right. She's far right, she lacks an ally on the right. The left came to power 5 years ago because they had the support of the far left. So the far left supporting the left. But in France now, the right
Girard,
does not support
sorry to interrupt.
the far right. So
Sorry,
if she can bring the left...
Sorry, Mr. Girard, sorry to interrupt. We'll come into the minute politics of the allies that she may or may not have to make and how the other runners and riders in this election are in a little while. But in terms of the people you're speaking to, the ordinary French person on the street, what is it about Marine Le Pen that is so attractive at this moment in time? You're obviously, as a very accomplished journalist over many years, you've obviously been speaking to people across France about this woman and this party.
Yeah, I mean, she's quite popular now because there's kind of a rejection of the old system, if you like, of all politicians, and she has never been, or her party has never been in power. She's also softening her position. She said that she could choose a prime minister, she would choose a prime minister that is not from her party, and that she would make a government of national union with all what she said, the patriots, the people who like France, like her, she said. So it's true that, and she has done a very good clip, you know, an advertising clip for the campaign, which is very good, where she seemed like to be very appeased and soft. So she's a very good communicator.
Okay,
And,
well,
but
that gives us a good idea of where she's coming from.
50% of the vote is quite a challenge.
Sure, Mr. Girard, that gives us a good idea of where she's coming from. Let's go over to, that gives us a good idea of where she is or where she sits on the political map. Let's go over to Yasser Louati. Obviously, Marine Le Pen comes over as a very accomplished politician, but the party has its roots in the far right. What is it like at this present moment in time to be a Muslim in France?
Mr. Girard said Marine Le Pen has been softening her position. I don't know what he's talking about when she has been demonizing Muslims for the past, 10 years, ever since she became a national figure. Second, don't forget that, whatever was, portrayed to be marginal or extremist discourse in terms of racism and especially hatred or Islamophobia targeting Muslim citizens has now become mainstream. So much so that Marine Le Pen declared recently that when Manuel Valls speaks, I feel that he's speaking for me. That's for one. Second, we shouldn't forget what a famous resistant to the Nazis once said: ordinary men do not know that everything is possible. So yes, Marine Le Pen does lack a wide enough base in order to become a president, but if we talk about the ideological debate and how she is able to set the agenda when it comes to debates, the far right and especially Marine Le Pen have been winning for the past several years. So even though she does not come to power, the question is, how come her ideas are being practiced or implemented both by the right and even with the left under François Hollande and Manuel Valls?
Okay, let me bring in Rémi Piet here. You're nodding your head, sir. You've been able to listen to, you might say, the two sides of the argument or debate we have at the moment. What's your initial impression of Marine Le Pen and why at this present moment in time is she relatively popular and, as far as pollsters are concerned, a dead cert to get into the final runoff?
Well, there's some elements of common ground between the two intervenants before me, in the sense that clearly the ideology of the political party of Marine Le Pen is clearly racist and xenophobic. However, it is true that Marine Le Pen, for electoral gains, is trying to soften her image to try to be more, let's say, acceptable to a majority of the people. I do agree, however, that her chances to win in these elections are slightly limited, but even if she actually doesn't win, the fact that she's most likely about to arrive as number one in the first round is going to be something of historical proportion. And her ideas of being anti-immigrants, of being very xenophobic, of trying to pull the European Union, the France out of the European Union, have been more and more mainstream and part of the political discourse other candidates. So the fact that she might not win the election is not an end in itself. Her ideas of hatred and xenophobia have been, being portrayed and pushed by other candidates on the political spectrum, Nicolas Sarkozy in the various elections, for example. Something that is new, however, today is the fact that the new candidates that are going to be facing Marine Le Pen are all fairly fresh and new. It's not François Hollande in the Socialist Party, it's not Nicolas Sarkozy in the Republican Party, and therefore she cannot play anymore that easily on their idea of being anti-establishment and the only one being anti-establishment, because other political candidates are also able to push that card.
But isn't there the issue, certainly with Marine Le Pen, is she's still labelling them the establishment. Therefore, you might say the mudslinging has already started, and when you are part of an established long-term political party in France, in her particular case, she can throw that mud for the time being, while those parties seem to be in flux about what their policies are and how they're trying to sell their message to the French public.
Absolutely, and she's trying to base her discourse on the fact that all the other political parties are corrupt or are part of the system. And when you actually look at it, the National Front is maybe the one party that is facing the most potential scandals on the judiciary scene, and even the big scandal right now, which is faced by Francois Fillon of hiring his wife as an employee of the General Assembly, is something that we've seen in the National Front for several years, and there's a case right now between the European Union and National Front. So all the criticism that she might have on corruption and lack of clear institutions and trying to bring something fresh and new is something that doesn't apply to her political party, because her political party and herself are actually really much part of the establishment, the old figure of the French politics. However, in front of her, you're going to see Emmanuel Macron, Benoît Hamon, even François Fillon to a certain extent are actually newcomers on the political scene, and will be able to try to gather those votes that are trying to change the system or trying to attract new faces to the forefront of French politics.
Okay, for our international viewers now, let's just try and talk in terms of themes now, because this is how the French election is going to transpire. Renaud, Girard, can I come to you, sir? The French constitution and the law revolving around secular France revolves around a complete separation of church and state. It's very clear what the law is for immigrants moving there and for their children that are born there, as it is for French, you might say French nationals who've been there for generations. But time and again, we see Muslims challenging that law. So can Islam really sit comfortably within a secular state? Is this not one of the main points of this particular election?
I think that, we have had a mosque in Paris even before the Second World War, after the First World War. I mean, this is not a problem of Islam, but it's true that French public doesn't want our habits to change. For instance, if, pork has been, served in schools for food in schools for like 100 years, I mean, the French public is not ready to change that. The French electoral think that it's not the French who are born in France who have to adapt to the immigrants, but the immigrants who have to adapt to the French rules and the French way of life. But it's not true that, Marine Le Pen does not attack Islam as a religion. And by the way, she has some Muslims in France supporting her. But she's very strict on secularism, and she wants, if you like, to protect French identity. This is a main thing. She will have a problem because she wants also to protect French identity against Europe. She's not pro-Europe. She is pro the nation and pro the French districts, but she doesn't like Europe, and she doesn't like Europe based on regions like Catalonia, Bavaria, Aquitaine, and so on.
And that's fine. We'll get onto the regions in a moment. If I can then just bring in...
She's really insisting on French identity.
Sure. I mean, it's a fair point. Let's just bring in Yasser Louati here in terms of the fact that there is a scenario where the French now as a whole nation are really evaluating their relationship with their Muslim neighbours, even if they've lived side by side for decades. But the scenario is that in the last decade or so, we've seen 12 major incidents perpetrated predominantly by Muslims, whether they're immigrants or whether they're nationals of the country. Toulouse, we saw a Jewish school attacked in 2012. We had the Charlie Hebdo attack in January 2015. We've seen the Batalan concert attack in November 15. And only the weekend we saw a Louvre museum attack and a man with a machete. Is it any wonder that French people as a whole have a real concern about Muslims as a community group, whether they are immigrants or whether they are French nationals?
Well, first, the question, is quite complex. You can't answer it with very simplistic arguments. First,
I don't think it's a simplistic argument. I don't think it's a simplistic
years.
argument when you have these major incidents.
I'm answering
there's 10
you, sir.
of them, and then
Sir,
you have
let me answer.
then you have a political leader jumping on those issues as part of an election campaign. Of course, it's not trivial in any respect. For
Okay,
Marine
yes.
Le Pen.
Can I answer?
Of course you can now.
Sir, I'm just answering you. Okay. So first, the people you mentioned supposedly to be Muslims attacking newspapers and targeting Jews, etc., are themselves or have been themselves killing Muslims by the thousands for over a decade. Don't forget that Muslims are by far, it's actually 10,000 to 1 that Muslims are victims of terrorism. Even in France, almost every single time there was an attack, some Muslims were killed. As it happened, for example, with this policeman, Ahmed Merabet, killed while he was defending the Charlie Hebdo building, then again in November 2015, and again in the Bastille Day attack, when 33% of the victims were Muslims. The question of terrorism is not about religion, it's about geopolitics and extremist ideology. If Muslims were the problems, how come they are targeted abroad and also at home here? Coming now to French identity, how come French Muslims are still not portrayed as fully fledged French citizens? Some have reached the 3rd and 4th generation, and Mr. Renaud Girard from Le Figaro again speaks about Muslims, challenging French identity and the secular law. First, Muslims are not challenging the secular law. They're asking for the strict application of the law of laïcité, meaning that strict separation between the state and religion and no interference of the state within religious affairs. For example, laïcité went from being a constitutional principle, as was the case in 1905, to becoming an ideology. And as François Barouin from the Republican Party said, now laïcité has to target Muslims after winning the struggle against Catholicism. And he goes on further saying that laïcité, the new laïcité, as he's talking about it, is incompatible with human rights. We only spoke about laïcité the day Muslim citizens became visible and saying, yes, I am French and yes, I am Muslim. Third, Muslims have not asked for pork not to be served in public schools. They're actually saying, while you serve pork, let us have something else. The same applies, for example, to Jewish kids. And I went to public schools and I was served eggs or whatever else, like, fried fish. Now coming to the question of the identity politics, the sole losers of all this are the French people as a whole. Every single time we have a social issue, we speak about Muslims. Every single time we ask why these terrorist attacks happen, we talk not about our failed foreign policy and becoming an enemy within the global agenda, but talking about Muslims as the enemy within.
Mr. Louati, let me bring in...
The last point is...
Mr. Louati, let me bring it.
One last point.
Okay.
Don't forget, ISIL explicitly called for this in 2015 in their article, Destroying the Grey Zone. The idea of these terrorist attacks is making it impossible for Muslims and non-Muslims to live peacefully within Western countries.
Rémi, Piet, I'll come to you in a moment. I could see you listening intently to that argument being made. But Renaud, Girard, can I come to you back in Paris? Can I ask you to respond to what Yasser Louati has said?
Okay, I was in my school in the 1960s and 70s. I had a lot of Jews in my school, and they never asked pork not to be served. I mean, we had a lot of Jewish immigrants just before the Second World War, and after, fleeing the survivors of the Holocaust, and they never asked to change the French laws. They never asked not to go on French schools in Saturday because it was the Shabbat. So it's true that you have like habits and way of life of France, and the French do not want to change the way of life. The fact that Muslims are the first victims of terrorism, of ISIL or whatever, it's true. This is a fact. This is a fact of life. It's also a fact that in France and in other countries also, but mainly in France, I mean, the only terrorist attacks that are led in the name of Islam. Of course, it's a wrong revendication, but it's made. No, there is no attacks made on the name of Judaism, on Buddhism, or Catholicism, or Protestantism,
Indeed.
Whatever. I mean, the only terrorists that we have are made in the name of Islam, and it's true. It's very unfortunate. I agree with that. It's very unfortunate, but it's bad public relations for Islam. Yes, it is bad public relations.
Okay, let me bring in Rémi Piet there. Of course, we can talk about the issue of how religion is playing a huge factor in the way the election campaign is going, but also let's just talk about the globalisation that Marine Le Pen also wants to address, and that she's quite happy to take France out of the EU. Very similar, obviously, to what the UK have already done or will be doing in the coming years. How much is that resonating at grassroots level?
Okay, so let's take the two questions separately. First thing on the fact that Islam is playing an important role in the elections. It's actually very unfortunate because we need to stress out the fact that 95% of Muslims in France are actually backing the secular system, and there's a large majority of Muslims in France are extremely against the different attacks. They actually, those attacks are being used for political gain by political parties that try to gather some support for their own agenda and platform, and Marine Le Pen being the first one among them. The problem here is maybe the fact that there was a failure over the last 20 to 30 years of trying to bring up some minorities to the forefront of public figures, whether it's through TV or politics or key positions in companies, and that would be the case for the Muslim minority. It could be the same thing for the African American population, or women also generally also are less represented. So there's this problem of not having those public figures that could be some examples both for the minorities themselves, but also to mitigate the political discourse of xenophobic parties, say, just trying to show Muslims as just the one backing the terrorist attacks, which is absolutely false. On the geopolitical element, which is your second question, the will from Marine Le Pen to move away from the European Union, which has been a claim from the National Front for decades and farther before, is basically a normal strategy as for any nationalist party that tries to regain control of the state and try to reject any kind of supranational entity, the same way that Donald Trump, for example, in the US is trying to reject any kind of supranational control from the United Nations or trade agreement. So it's a repli sur soi, just coming back on living with one another and rejecting the exterior. And the fact that she has always blamed the European Union for any kind of wrongdoing is part of a political platform. Now, what's interesting is how this resonates among the electorate. And I think we have to stress the fact that almost all the political candidates that are now for the presidential elections, whether the Socialist Party with Benoît Hamon or Francois Fillon for the Republicans, had actually voted no for the referendum in Maastricht referendum for the institution of the euro. So there's also different ways of trying to show that there should be something different than the current European Union, sure, that there should be a membership of the European Union, but along different lines. For example, different policy, different integration of national country, different types of policies, especially in terms of economic policy, opening maybe much more the potential possibilities of budgetary investment rather than to have a very rigorous financial policy. So the fact that portraying Marine Le Pen as the only candidate that would be against the European Union and just kicking France out of the European Union would be very caricatural, because other candidates, although they want to remain inside the European Union, are actually pushing forward for a very strong agenda of reforming the institution itself. So it's not a yes or no, and I hope that throughout the presidential election, this debate will be less passionate and more interesting to understand the fundamentals of what could be a reformed European Union that doesn't mean leaving as the British did, and which actually will cost them down the road.
And there for the moment we have to leave it, gentlemen. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. Renaud, Girard, the Chief Foreign Correspondent for Figaro, Rémi, Piet, Research Associate at the University of Miami, and Yasser, Louati, Civil Liberties and Human Rights Activist there also in Paris. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. You can watch the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com, and for further discussion go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail, Rahman and all of the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.